The sun in this part of the country didn't rise, it bled. A slow, violent seep of crimson and gold that stained the edges of the jagged, black mountains before spilling across the vast, empty canvas of the plains. It was a fierce, unforgiving beauty, the kind that made a person feel small, insignificant, and utterly alone. For Eleanor Hartley, standing on the porch of the small cabin Jacob had built with his own 2 hands, that feeling had become as familiar as the ache in her bones. It was 1870. The land itself was a contradiction, brutal and tender all at once. The wind was a constant thief, stealing warmth from the skin and moisture from the soil, leaving behind cracked earth and chapped lips. It whispered through the tall, dry grasses with a lonely hiss, a sound that echoed the hollowness that had taken up residence in Eleanor's chest 6 months ago. That was when the men from the logging camp, hats in their hands and eyes fixed on the dirt, had brought Jacob home. A falling giant, they'd said, a titan of timber that had taken her own giant with it. They had expected her to leave, of course, the town, a dusty collection of ramshackle buildings a hard day's ride away, had buzzed with the predictable, pitying assumption. A woman alone. A widow of 28 with no kin for 1,000 miles. She'd sell the claim, pack her grief into a wagon, and scurry back east to the soft, civilized world where women were sheltered from the harsh realities of life and death. Eleanor had listened to their advice, nodded at their concern, and then, with a quiet finality that left them sputtering, she had stayed. She stayed because the cabin smelled of Jacob of pine sawdust, sweat, and cheap tobacco. She stayed because leaving felt like a second betrayal, an admission that the life they had carved out together in this wilderness was nothing without him. Most of all, she stayed out of a stubborn refusal to be broken. The world saw a fragile widow. Eleanor was determined to show it a survivor. Survival, however, was a relentless, grinding affair. Days were measured in chores, chopping wood until her shoulders screamed, hauling water from the well until her hands were raw, tending the small, stubborn vegetable patch that Jacob had fenced off from hungry deer, mending, cleaning, loading the rifle he'd taught her to use, and sleeping with it beside her bed. The loneliness was a physical presence, a cold weight that settled on her in the evenings when the last of the light bled from the sky and the coyotes began their sad, wild chorus. She spoke to herself, to the chickens, to the memory of Jacob, her voice sounding strange and thin in the immense silence. Grief was a dust storm, coating everything in a fine layer of gray. It was in the empty space beside her in the too large bed, in the second cup of coffee she no longer made, in the sight of his worn leather gloves hanging on a peg by the door. Some days, it choked her. On those days, the world shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin and the crushing weight of her loss. She felt dirty, not just from the grime of her labor, but from the inside out, as if the sorrow itself was a filth she couldn't scrub away. It was during one of these bleak spells, a week after a dust storm had nearly buried her garden, that she found it, driven by a desperate need for air that wasn't thick with dust and memory. She had walked farther than usual, following a line of hardy cottonwoods that suggested a resilience she envied. She pushed through a dense thicket of choked cherry bushes, their branches scratching at her arms. And then the sound reached her, a low, liquid murmur, a sound so gentle and out of place in this harsh landscape that it felt like a dream. There, tucked into a shallow canyon carved by time and water, was a creek. It wasn't a mighty river, just a modest, determined flow of water that tumbled over smooth, gray stones. It ran clear and cold, sheltered from the relentless sun by the canyon walls and the canopy of trees. Sunlight dappled through the leaves, dancing on the water's surface. It was a secret place, a sanctuary. Eleanor sank to her knees on the grassy bank, the sight and sound washing over her. for the first time in months. A breath came easily, deeply. It felt like a discovery, a gift from a land that had so far only taken from her. She dipped her calloused hands into the water, gasping at the clean, biting cold. It was real. It was hers. She returned the next morning, just as the first light was touching the highest peaks. A towel and a small piece of lye soap were tucked into a bundle under her arm. The air was cool, the world hushed and waiting. At the creek's edge, she hesitated for only a moment. There was no one for miles. The birds and the squirrels were her only audience. With trembling fingers, she unbuttoned her worn calico dress, letting it fall in a heap at her feet. Then her chemise, her underthings, until she stood bare under the vast, open sky. Her skin, pale and shielded from the sun, seemed luminous in the dawn light. She felt a lifetime of modesty and convention fall away with her clothes. This wasn't shameful. It was necessary. The water was a shock, a cold, clean fire that stole her breath and sent a jolt through her entire body. She waded deeper, the current pulling gently at her legs, the smooth stones cool beneath her feet. She submerged herself completely, the icy water a baptism, and came up sputtering, her hair streaming behind her. It was more than a bath. It was a cleansing of the soul. As she lathered the soap, the scent of lies sharp and honest. She felt as though she were scrubbing away not just the trail dust and sweat, but the sticky residue of sorrow, the clinging phantom touch of pitying neighbors, the heavy shroud of widowhood. Here, in this secret place, she was not Jacob's grieving wife or that poor Hartley woman. She was just Eleanor, a woman of flesh and blood, alive and feeling. The sun warmed her bare shoulders, the water caressed her skin, and for a few precious moments, the hollowness inside her was filled with the simple, profound sensation of being. This became her ritual. Every dawn, before the sun had a chance to bake the land, she would make the pilgrimage to her creek. It was the one part of her day that was holy for her, a small act of reclamation. She learned the nuances of the place which rock was best for sitting, where the current was strongest, the way the light filtered through the leaves at different times of the morning. The daily immersion became a source of strength, a quiet communion that fortified her for the long, hard day ahead. She would return to the cabin, skin tingling and fresh, ready to face the solitude and the labor. She knew she was being watched. It didn't happen all at once. It was a slow, dawning awareness, a subtle shift in the atmosphere of her sanctuary. At first, she dismissed it. A deer, perhaps, or a curious coyote, a snap of a twig that was too deliberate for a falling branch, a rustle in the high rocks on the opposite side of the canyon that the wind could not explain. Then, it became a feeling, a prickling on the back of her neck, a certainty as solid and real as the water on her skin. There were eyes on her. Panic was the first instinctive response. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Every story she'd ever heard about the dangers of the frontier rushed through her mind. Outlaws, renegades, lone madmen. Her heart hammered against her ribs, and her first impulse was to scramble for her clothes, to run back to the relative safety of her cabin and the rifle that leaned against the wall. But she didn't. She froze, waist deep in the cold water, and forced herself to be still, to listen beyond the frantic beating of her own heart. She scanned the rim of the canyon, the dense shadows beneath the pines, the jumble of sun-bleached rocks. She saw nothing. No movement, no glint of metal, nothing. Yet the feeling remained. It was a steady, unwavering gaze, and as the moment stretched on, the nature of it seemed to change. The initial terror began to recede, replaced by something else, something she couldn't name. The presence didn't feel predatory. There was no malice in the air, no sense of imminent danger. It was just there, a watchfulness that was as patient and silent as the ancient rocks themselves. A strange thought, born of her profound loneliness. took root in her mind to be seen, even by an unseen observer, was a kind of company. For months, she had been invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of her own life. Now, someone was watching her. Someone was bearing witness to her quiet act of defiance, her daily ritual of renewal. The next morning, she went back. It was a conscious choice, an act of sheer will against the lingering tremor of fear. She told herself it was foolish, that she was inviting disaster. But the pull of the creek, of her cleansing ritual, was stronger. As she undressed, her movements were more deliberate, her senses heightened. She felt the gaze settle on her as she stepped into the water, a tangible weight in the cool air. She knew, and she did not stop. Day after day, the silent dance continued. She would arrive at dawn, and she would feel the eyes upon her. She never saw him, but she knew he was there, the watcher on the ridge. She found herself performing her ritual for him. In a way, the unpinning of her long, brown hair, letting it cascade over her shoulders, the slow, deliberate way she washed her arms, her neck, the curve of her back. It was not a performance of seduction, but one of raw, unapologetic humanity. Asterisk, see me. The gesture seemed to say, asterisk, see that I am still here, I am still alive. She began to wonder about him. Who was he? A trapper, a prospector hiding from the law, an Indian. The last thought sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold water. The townspeople spoke of the Lakota as ghosts, as savages lying in wait. But the quiet, unobtrusive nature of her observer didn't fit those fearful stories. His watchfulness was respectful, almost reverent. It was a strange, unsettling intimacy, forged across a distance of rock and air, in total silence. One morning, as the sun broke over the canyon rim and she waded out of the water, a hawk cried out from high above. She looked up, shielding her eyes, and watched it circle in the vast, blue emptiness. For the first time in a long time, the emptiness didn't feel like a void. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. She reached for her towel, her movements fluid and sure, acutely aware of the silent, unknown eyes that watched her claim the dawn. She knew she was not alone, and for reasons she could not begin to comprehend. The thought brought her not fear, but a strange and stirring flicker of comfort. From his vantage point high on the canyon ridge, hidden within a cluster of weathered granite and ancient, twisted juniper, Tasunke watched the world be born again. The sun's first rays struck the opposite cliff face, turning the stone from deep purple to a warm rose gold. Down below, in the cool shadows, the creek was a silver thread woven through the dark green of the cottonwoods. For him, this time of day had always been sacred, a time for quiet reflection before the world of men, with all its noise and sorrow, awoke. For the past several weeks, however, the dawn had taken on a new significance. It had become the time he watched the white woman. Tasunke was a man of 32 winters, born to the Oglala Lakota, when the buffalo still darkened the plains for days, and the only white men were a few strange trappers who knew how to respect the land. Now, the world was fractured. He lived in the space between the memory of what was and the harsh reality of what was becoming. The bluecoats built their iron forts on sacred ground. Their wagon trails scarred the earth like open wounds. And the endless tide of *Wasichu* settlers gnawed away at the edges of the Black Hills, their hunger for land and yellow rock insatiable. His duty was clear. He was a warrior. His name, Tasunke, was a name of honor. His purpose was to watch, to scout, to protect his people from the encroaching danger. That was why he had been tracking the path of this new cabin, a raw scar of fresh-cut pine in a landscape that should have remained untouched. It was an outpost of the enemy, and the man who had built it represented a threat. Tasunke had watched him, a large, loud man who swung his axe with more force than sense, felling trees that had stood for 100 winters. Tasunke had felt the familiar, bitter anger rise in him. Then the man was gone. One day the cabin was full of his boisterous energy. The next, it was silent. Tasunke had watched as other white men brought the big man's body back on a wagon. He had watched as they dug a hole in the unforgiving soil. And he had watched the woman. He had expected her to leave. They always did when their men were gone. The land was too hard, too lonely for their soft women. But she had not left. He had first seen her at the creek by accident. He had been tracking a pronghorn that had come down to drink, moving with the silence that was his birthright. When he heard a splash, his hand went instantly to the knife at his belt, his body melting into the shadows of the rocks. He expected a soldier, a prospector. Instead, through a gap in the foliage, he saw her. She was standing in the water, her back to him, her skin so pale it seemed to gather and hold the fragile dawn light. His first reaction was suspicion, mingled with a warrior's contempt. A *wasichu* woman, alone and vulnerable, foolish, reckless. She was an intruder, desecrating this quiet, hidden place with her presence. He should have slipped away, gone back to his camp and reported her. A lone woman was a weakness in the enemy's camp, a piece of information that could be used. Yet he remained. He did not move. He watched as she cupped the cold water in her hands and let it run over her face and shoulders. He saw the tension in her back, the faint tremor in her arms. This was not the casual bathing of a woman at peace. There was a desperation in her movements, a deep, abiding sorrow in the way her body slumped. He had seen that same posture in the women of his own tribe after a battle, after sickness had stolen a child. He recognized grief. It was a language that needed no translation. He came back the next day, telling himself it was a warrior's duty to observe the enemy. He found the same position, the same rocky perch that offered concealment and a clear view. And he watched her again. He watched her unpin her long, dark hair, a motion of quiet ceremony. He watched her step into the frigid water without hesitation, her gasp silent from his distance, but visible in the sudden tensing of her shoulders. He saw the strength in her. It was in the set of her jaw, in the determined way she scrubbed her skin, as if trying to wash away more than just dirt. The creek for his people was *Mniwikoni*, water of life. It was a place for cleansing not just the body, but the spirit. He watched her, and he understood that for her, in her own way, it was the same. She was not merely washing. She was fighting. She was pushing back against the encroaching darkness of her loss, using the cold, clear water as her shield and her weapon. He saw a spirit in her that he had never associated with her people. The white women he had seen in the forts or the dusty towns were either frail, frightened creatures who flinched from the sun, or they were hard-faced and loud, their eyes full of greed. This woman was different, alone in the vast wilderness. She was not afraid of the silence or the solitude. She embraced it. She came to this sacred place and made it her own, drawing a quiet power from it that was visible even from his distant perch. His internal conflict was a silent storm. His loyalty, his very identity, was tied to his people. This woman was part of the tide that was destroying their way of life. The cabin she lived in stood on land that had been Lakota hunting ground for generations. By all logic and duty, she was the enemy. But his heart, his warrior's instinct, told him something different. The heart did not see a *wasichu*. It saw a woman of immense courage, battling a private war with a stoicism he could only admire. His curiosity became a kind of obsession, a need to understand this contradiction. The day he knew she was aware of him, the world shifted. He had shifted his weight, dislodging a single, small pebble. It was a tiny sound, no louder than a beetle falling from a leaf. But in the stillness of the dawn, it was a thunderclap. He saw her body go rigid. He saw her head lift, her gaze sweeping the canyon rim, searching. He held his breath, every muscle in his body taut, ready to vanish. He expected a scream. He expected her to scramble for the bank, to grab her clothes and flee in terror. It was what any other woman would do. She did nothing of the sort. She remained where she was, waist deep in the current, and slowly, deliberately, turned to face his general direction. She could not see him. He knew. He was one with the rock in the shadow. But she looked toward him, her head tilted, her expression unreadable across the distance. She stood that way for a long moment, a pale, defiant statue in the heart of the wilderness. Then, with an unnerving calm, she turned away and continued her bathing. Tasunke felt a jolt, a profound shock of respect that transcended race and conflict. She knew, he was certain of it, and she was not afraid. Or if she was, her courage was greater than her fear. She had been confronted with the unknown, the ultimate terror of the frontier, a hidden watcher in a wild place, and she had not broken. She had held her ground. That single act changed everything. His observation was no longer a secret. It was a communication, a silent, shared acknowledgement. He was there. She knew he was there. And she kept coming. Her continued presence was an answer, a challenge, and a thing of wonder. She was trusting him, trusting that the silent presence on the ridge meant her no harm. It was a trust so profound, so utterly at odds with the hatred and fear that defined the relationship between their peoples, that it humbled him. It made him the guardian of her solitude, the keeper of her ritual. To frighten her now, to reveal himself, would be a violation of that unspoken pact. So he continued to watch. But his purpose had changed. He was no longer scouting an enemy. He was bearing witness. He watched the way the rising sun would catch the water droplets on her skin, turning them to tiny jewels. He learned the shape of her, the graceful line of her neck, the strength in her shoulders. He saw her as a part of the landscape itself, as natural and as beautiful as the hawk that circled overhead or the deer that sometimes came to drink downstream. The creek had become their shared space, a boundary line where two worlds could touch without colliding. For those few moments at dawn, she was not a white settler and he was not a Lakota warrior. They were simply a man and a woman, held in the quiet embrace of the wilderness, connected by a silence that was more profound than any words. He would watch until she had finished, until she had dressed and her footsteps had faded on the trail back to the cabin. Only then would he rise from his hiding place, his joints stiff from stillness. He would stand and look out over the land, at the small cabin with its plume of smoke rising into the clean morning air. The anger he felt toward her people was still there, a hot coal in his gut. The sorrow for what was being lost was a constant ache. But now, tangled with it all, was a new, complex emotion, a fierce, protective curiosity for the woman with the warrior's spirit. The woman who knew she was being watched and met the dawn, unafraid. The unspoken understanding between the watcher and the watched settled into a quiet rhythm. The initial fear Eleanor had felt was long gone, replaced by a strange and profound sense of security. The eyes on the ridge were not a threat. They were a presence, a silent witness that affirmed her existence in this vast, empty land. She was no longer just a solitary woman struggling against the wilderness. She was a woman who was seen. This new reality prompted a new impulse within her, a desire to bridge the silence, to give something back to the quiet guardian she could feel but never see. An acknowledgement for an acknowledgement. One morning, her hands moving with purpose, she took an extra portion of her sourdough starter and kneaded a small, round loaf. It was a simple thing, made of flour, water, and salt. But it was a product of her world, of her hearth. It was food. Yes, but it was also a message. Tucking the still warm loaf, wrapped in a clean cloth, under her arm, she made her way to the creek. After her bath, as she dressed on the bank, she felt the familiar, steady gaze. Her heart beat a little faster, a nervous flutter in her chest. She walked to a large, flat rock near the water's edge, a natural table of sun-warmed granite. Carefully, she unwrapped the bread and placed it in the center of the stone. She hesitated for a moment, then turned and walked away without looking back. The feeling of the eyes following her all the way to the tree line. The entire walk home. Her mind raced. Would he understand? Would he think it was a trick, an offering of poisoned food, or worse? Would he simply ignore it, leaving it for the squirrels and the birds to peck apart from his perch? Tasunke watched the entire exchange, his body utterly still, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and wonder. He saw her place the small, pale bundle on the rock. He watched her leave. For a long time after she was gone, he remained hidden, scanning the area for any sign of a trap. The ways of the *Wasichu* were often crooked and filled with deceit, but his instinct, the same instinct that had told him this woman was different, told him this was not a trick. When the sun was higher and he was certain he was alone, he descended from the ridge, his moccasins making no sound on the pine needles and stone. He approached the rock with a hunter's caution. The object was strange, soft and pale, and it gave off a warm, pleasing scent he had only ever smelled from the bakeries in the white man's forts. It was bread. He knew what it was. A gift. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked, still warm from her oven. This was the food of her people, made with her own hands. It was an offering of peace, an act of trust so audacious, so contrary to the world of violence that separated them, that it struck him speechless. He broke off a small piece and tasted it. It was simple, wholesome, and in that moment, it was the most profound thing he had ever eaten. He wrapped it carefully in the cloth and carried it back to his small, hidden camp, a strange warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the morning sun. The next dawn, before she arrived, he was there, on the same flat rock. He placed his own offering, not words, not a face, but a message in the language he knew. 3 silver-bellied trout, caught that morning from the coldest part of the creek, gutted and cleaned, and laid carefully upon a bed of green leaves. He retreated to his hiding place and waited. When Eleanor saw the fish, she stopped dead in her tracks. They were perfect, their skin shimmering in the morning light. A gift in return. A conversation had begun. A wave of emotion so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her relief. Gratitude, and a thrilling, terrifying sense of connection. That evening, she pan-fried the trout in cornmeal, and as she ate the sweet, flaky flesh, she felt a little less alone in the world. Thus began their silent dance, their wordless dialogue. The flat rock by the creek became their post office, their meeting ground. One day she would leave a jar of wild plum preserves, its deep purple a jewel against the gray stone. A few days later, she would find a brace of quail, dressed and ready for her pot. She left a handful of carrots from her garden, their green tops still attached. In return, she found a cluster of wild onions and a bundle of sage, the kind her own mother had said was good for calming teas. His gifts were never just about sustenance. One morning, she found a single, perfect eagle feather lying on the rock, its white tip and dark bands a thing of stark beauty. Another time, it was a spray of brilliant crimson Indian paintbrush, its color a shock against the muted greens and browns of the canyon. And once, most mysteriously, she found a flint arrowhead, not a new one, but an ancient one, its edges worn smooth by time. It felt heavy in her palm, a piece of the land's deep, secret history. She kept these treasures in a small wooden box on her mantelpiece, tangible proof of her silent friend. This fragile, secret world she had built was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats one hot afternoon. Eleanor was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a comfort, when she looked up to see a man on horseback emerging from the trail that led to town. She recognized him immediately. Clint Barrett. Barrett was a man who owned the local saloon and held sway over the town's less reputable men. He was large and fleshy, with a thick neck and small, calculating eyes that seemed to miss nothing and value little. He fancied himself a gentleman, but his smile was a predator's, all teeth and no warmth. He had offered his condolences after Jacob's death, his words slick with a sympathy that felt more like an appraisal. "Afternoon, Mrs. Hartley," he called out, swinging down from his horse with a proprietary air. He let the reins drop, confident the animal wouldn't stray, working mighty hard for a lady in mourning. Eleanor leaned the axe against the chopping block, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her glove. "The wood won't split itself, Mr. Barrett." "That it won't." He chuckled, his eyes roaming over the cabin, the neat stacks of wood, the fenced-in garden. He was assessing her claim. She knew, calculating its worth. "Which is my point entirely. This is no life for a woman alone. It ain't right. It ain't safe." "I manage," Eleanor said, her voice cool and even. "For now. Maybe," he conceded. Stepping closer, he smelled of whiskey and cheap cigars. But winter's coming, and this land, well, it's got troubles. You hear the talk in town. The Lakota are restless, the army's stretched thin. A lone woman is a prime target for a raiding party. They get brazen, you know, got no respect for property, or for a white woman. The words, dripping with casual venom, sent a chill down her spine. He was speaking of her silent guardian's people. The contrast between Barrett's ugly caricature and the respectful, gentle presence she felt at the creek was jarring. "I have my rifle. Mr. Barrett, I can take care of myself." "A rifle's no match for a dozen screaming savages." "Ma'am," he said, his voice lowering into a conspiratorial tone, "what you need is a man's protection." "A husband." He let the word hang in the air between them. "This is a fine piece of land. Good water, plenty of timber. A man could do well here. Asterisk. We asterisk could do well here." There it was, the true purpose of his visit. He didn't see a grieving woman. He saw an opportunity, a piece of property with a vulnerable owner he could easily acquire through a marriage certificate. The audacity of it, the sheer greedy presumption, made her blood run hot. "My husband's grave is not yet 6 months old. Sir," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I am not in the market for another, and this land is not for sale." Barrett's smile tightened. The thin veneer of civility cracked. "A woman can't hold a claim on her own. Eleanor, you know the law. It'll be challenged. You need a man's name on the deed." "My name." He took another step. "Invading her space. Don't be foolish. I'm offering you a respectable way out of a bad situation. A woman like you, all alone out here, you'll be begging for my help come the first snow or the first sign of red trouble." Eleanor stood her ground, her chin lifted. "I will take my chances. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Good day, Mr. Barrett." She turned her back on him and picked up the axe. A clear dismissal. For a moment, she thought he might grab her. His frustration was a palpable force in the air. She heard him grunt, a sound of pure annoyance. Then the creak of leather as he mounted his horse. "You'll regret this." "Eleanor," he called out as he rode away, "when you're screaming for help in the middle of the night, don't expect me to come riding." She didn't watch him go. She stood there, her knuckles white on the handle of the axe, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. Clint Barrett was a bully and a ghoul, but he was also the voice of the world she lived in, a world that said she was weak, that she was a fool for staying, that her only value was as an attachment to a man and his property. His words about the Lakota echoed in her mind, poisoning the pure, clean connection she had felt. Were they really, as he said, was her watcher an exception? Or was she being dangerously naive? The town's fear, the ugly stories, the deeply ingrained prejudice, it was a tide of filth threatening to wash over her secret sanctuary. She was caught between two worlds, the loud, grasping world of men like Clint Barrett, and the quiet, watchful world of her silent friend on the ridge. The next morning, she went to the creek with a heavy heart. The air felt different, the silence now charged with the doubts Barrett had planted. She left a small bundle of dried apples on the rock, her offering feeling like a desperate question. As she bathed, she looked up toward the hidden perch on the ridge. The feeling of being watched was still there, a steady, comforting presence. But now, a new question hung in the air between them, a question born of fear and prejudice. Asterisk, who are you, asterisk, and asterisk? What world do you belong to, asterisk? The silent dance had grown more complex, its steps now shadowed by the looming threat of a world that would never understand. Clint Barrett's threat lingered in the air for days, a foul odor that tainted the clean pine scent of the forest. Eleanor found herself starting at every unfamiliar sound, the snap of a twig, the cry of a jay, the whisper of the wind through the eaves of the cabin. The peaceful solitude she had worked so hard to cultivate had been replaced by a gnawing anxiety. Her sanctuary at the creek was still her refuge, but even there, the memory of Barrett's leering face and greedy eyes was an unwelcome intrusion. Their silent conversation continued. She left a small pouch of roasted coffee beans, a rare luxury she'd been saving. In return, she found a beautifully beaded leather strip, small enough to be a bracelet, worked in patterns of blue and white that reminded her of the sky and the creek. The gift was more personal than any before it, an artifact of his culture, and she treasured it, tying it around her wrist where the worn calico of her sleeve would hide it. It was a secret bond, a tangible reminder that she was not as alone as Barrett wanted her to be. The confrontation, when it came, was not at dawn, but in the harsh, revealing light of midday. She was weeding her garden, the sun hot on her back, when the sound of multiple horses made her stand up straight, her hand instantly going to her throat. It was Barrett, and he was not alone. Flanking him were two men she recognized from Town Jed, a lanky, stoop-shouldered man with a perpetually mean squint, and Silas, a barrel-chested brawler whose knuckles were always bruised. They rode not like visitors, but like a posse, their horses fanning out to block any path of escape from the small cabin clearing. Eleanor's blood ran cold. She slowly placed her trowel on the ground and walked toward the porch, her mind racing. The rifle was inside, just by the door, if she could get to it. No need for that. Eleanor, Clint called out, his voice thick with false bonhomie. He swung down from his horse, his boots thudding onto the hard-packed earth. Jed and Silas remained mounted, their expressions a mixture of boredom and menace. They were his muscle, his audience. We've just come for a neighborly chat, to see if you've reconsidered my generous offer. I gave you my answer. Mr. Barrett, Eleanor said, her voice trembling only slightly. She forced herself to stand tall, to not let him see the fear that was making her knees weak. That was before you had time to think on it properly, he said, his smile widening as he strolled toward her. I've been thinking about you. A lot. About how this place is too much for you. And I've decided to make it simple. I'll give you $200 for the claim, lock, stock, and barrel. You take it and be on the first stage back east. Or, he paused, letting the silence stretch. You can accept my other proposal. We ride to the preacher this Saturday. Your choice. $200 was an insult. The land, with its timber and access to water, was worth 10 times that. It wasn't an offer. It was a threat wrapped in the language of commerce. And if I say no to both, she asked, her chin high. Barrett's smile vanished. That's not one of the choices. He stopped just a few feet from her. You see, I've filed a preliminary challenge to your claim. A woman can't work the land as required by law. It's an easy case to win. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm giving you the chance to walk away with something in your pocket. Or a ring on your finger. This is my home, she whispered, her voice fierce. You will not drive me from it. Wrong again. Jed sneered from his horse. "We surely will." Silas chuckled. A low, guttural sound. "The boss gets what he wants. Ma'am, always has." Barrett took another step, his shadow falling over her. "Last chance. Eleanor, what's it to be, the money? Or me?" "Neither," she said, and in that moment, she made a bolt for the cabin door. She almost made it. Her fingers brushed the rough wood of the doorframe, but Jed was faster. He spurred his horse forward, leaning down to grab her by the arm. His grip was like an iron band, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. She cried out, struggling against him, but it was useless. He dragged her back into the center of the yard, pulling her off her feet. "Feisty one, ain't she?" Jed laughed, yanking her upright. "I like that," Barrett said, his eyes gleaming with a sick light. "A little spirit will make taming her all the more satisfying." "Hold her." High on the ridge overlooking the cabin, hidden in a place no one would ever think to look, Tasunke watched the scene unfold, his entire body rigid with a violence he had held in check his entire life. He had been tracking a mountain lion that had been prowling too close to the deer trails, but his path had brought him within sight of her home. He saw the 3 riders arrive. He knew the one called Barrett. He had seen him in the town, a man who walked with the arrogance of a wolf in a chicken coop. Tasunke's hands clenched on the smooth wood of his bow. His law, the law of his people, was to avoid the white man's conflicts. To engage was to invite destruction. An arrow fired in anger could bring 100 soldiers in revenge. His duty was to observe, to report, to remain a ghost. But then he saw the lanky one grab her. He saw her cry of pain, the way she struggled like a captured bird. He saw the look on Barrett's face, and the laws of his people, the strategic concerns, the years of caution they all burned away in a flash of pure, protective rage. This was not a conflict of the whites. This was a pack of predators cornering their prey, and his spirit would not, could not, allow it. With a fluid grace that was faster than thought, he nocked an arrow. He drew the bowstring back to his cheek, his breath held, his world shrinking to the tiny gap between the arrow's flint head and the target. He did not aim to kill. To kill would be to start a war. He aimed to speak. Down in the yard, Jed was twisting Eleanor's arm behind her back. "Now you listen to what Mr. Barrett has to say." Asterisk thwack. Asterisk. The sound was like a giant hornet hitting wood. An arrow, seemingly from nowhere, slammed into the porch post, not an inch from Jed's head. The shaft quivered, humming with a deadly energy. Jed froze, his eyes wide with disbelief, his grip on Eleanor slackening. Silas cursed, his hand fumbling for the pistol at his belt. Before he could draw it, a second sound. Asterisk thwip. Asterisk. Another arrow sliced through the air, pinning the thick canvas of Silas's sleeve to the saddle of his horse. He yelled in a panic, trying to pull his arm free, which only made his terrified horse buck and skitter sideways. Barrett stared wildly around, his face pale with shock. "Who's out there? Show yourself!" Asterisk thump. Asterisk. A third arrow buried itself deep in the dirt at his feet, kicking up a spray of dust that spattered his boots. It was a message, delivered in the universal language of deadly accuracy. Asterisk. The first was a warning, the second was a promise, the third is your last chance. Panic erupted. The silent, unseen threat was more terrifying than any foe they could face. This wasn't a fair fight. It was an execution waiting to happen. "It's an ambush!" Silas screamed, finally ripping his sleeve free and spurring his frantic horse into a gallop. "Let's get out of here!" Jed shoved Eleanor to the ground and scrambled for his own horse, his face a mask of pure terror. He hauled himself into the saddle and kicked the animal into a panicked flight, not even looking back. Barrett was the last to move, frozen for a second by a mixture of fury and fear. He stared at the arrows, then up at the silent, tree-lined ridge. He looked back at Eleanor, who was pushing herself up from the ground, her face smudged with dirt but her eyes blazing. "This ain't over," he screamed, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "You've got a pet savage in the hills. Have you a dirty Indian lover? Fine, I'll be back, and I'll bring the whole damn cavalry down on you and your redskin." With that final, venomous promise, he turned and fled, galloping after his men, leaving a cloud of dust and the ringing silence of the aftermath behind him. Eleanor stood breathing heavily, her body trembling with adrenaline. The yard was empty. The immediate danger was gone. But a new, larger one had just been announced. She looked at the 3 arrows, one in the post, a silent sentinel, one in the dirt, a punctuation mark. She walked over and pulled the 3rd one from the ground, her fingers closing around the smooth, strong shaft. It was beautifully made, fletched with hawk feathers. It was a piece of him. She turned her face toward the ridge, toward the silent watcher who had saved her. Her voice, when it came, was clear and strong, carrying across the silent clearing. "Thank you." It was the first word she had ever spoken to him, a bridge of sound across the gulf of silence. High above, hidden from sight, Tasunke heard her. He watched her stand there, strong and defiant, holding his arrow in her hand. A fierce pride swelled in his chest, but it was quickly followed by a cold wave of dread. He had done it. He had interfered. He had saved her, but he had revealed his presence, his allegiance. Barrett's threat was not an idle one. The white men were always looking for an excuse, a reason to send their soldiers, to punish, to kill. By protecting this one woman, he had painted a target on the backs of his family, his friends, his people. He slipped back into the cover of the deep forest, the weight of his choice settling upon him like a shroud. The silent dance had ended. A far more dangerous game had just begun. The day after the attack, the dawn felt different. It was not a gentle awakening, but a raw, uncertain thing, the light seeming to expose every vulnerability. When Eleanor walked to the creek, she clutched the arrow in her hand, its sharp flint head a dangerous comfort against her palm. She no longer scanned the ridge with curiosity. She searched it with a desperate, aching need. Her gratitude was a wild thing in her chest, but it was tangled with a new, sharp fear not for herself, but for him. Clint Barrett's parting words had been a promise of poison, and she knew he was a man who kept such promises. She placed a small cloth bundle on the flat rock, 2 molasses cookies, the last of her sugar, but she did not leave. Instead, after her ritual in the cold water, she dressed and sat on the bank, her back against the trunk of a cottonwood, the arrow resting across her lap. She would wait. The silence between them had been broken by his act of violence on her behalf. It could not be rebuilt. She had to see him. She had to speak to him. She had no idea how long she would wait, an hour, a day, forever. It did not matter. Tasunke had watched her arrive, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. He had seen her place the offering, but then she had stayed. She was waiting for him. He had known this moment would come. His intervention had been a thrown stone, and the ripples were now reaching the shore. To remain hidden would be a coward's choice. He had made her a target by protecting her. He owed her the truth of the danger he had brought down upon them both. His decision was a heavy one, a betrayal of a lifetime of training and discipline. Warriors of the Lakota did not reveal themselves to their enemies. They did not speak with them, but as he looked down at her, sitting so patiently by the water, he knew he could no longer think of her as the enemy. She was Eleanor, and he had to go to her. He did not descend from his usual perch. Instead, he made a long, circular route through the forest, approaching the creek from downstream, giving her time to see him coming. Eleanor heard the faint crunch of a footstep on dry leaves, and her head snapped up, her body tensing. He emerged from the trees into the dappled sunlight of the canyon. He was nothing like the grotesque caricatures from the town's gossip. He was tall and lean, with the fluid, deliberate grace of a hunter. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a breechcloth, his chest and shoulders bare, his skin the color of rich, oiled leather. His black hair was long, held back from his face by a simple band, and his face was all strong angles and quiet intensity. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark and intelligent, and they were the same eyes she had felt on her for months, watchful, steady, and filled with a gravity that seemed to hold the weight of the entire wilderness. He carried his bow and a quiver of arrows, but he held them in a way that was not threatening. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gaze meeting hers directly for the first time. The air crackled with a tension that was thick and alive. It was the culmination of weeks of silent observation, of shared dawns, of unspoken questions. "You?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely a breath. It was all she could manage. He gave a slow, single nod. He had learned some of the white man's tongue from traders and soldiers. Enough for necessities, but not enough for the things he felt now. He pointed a finger at his own chest. "Tasunke! Tasunke!" She repeated the name, the syllables feeling strange and important on her tongue. "I am Eleanor." "Eleanor," he said, testing the sound. He took a slow step closer, his eyes flicking to the arrow in her lap. He gestured toward it. "For you." "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Thank you. You saved my life." Tasunke's expression was somber. He shook his head slightly, then pointed in the direction of the town. "Barrett, he brings trouble, more trouble now." He struggled for the right words, his hands helping to tell the story. He made the shape of a rifle, then held up all 10 fingers, then 10 again. "Soldiers, blue coats, they look for a reason." She understood immediately. His act of salvation was an act of provocation. Barrett would not tell the truth. He would twist it. He would report an Indian attack, and the cavalry would come looking for blood. "Because of me," she said, the realization landing with devastating force. "They will come because you helped me." "Yes," he said, his gaze unwavering. She looked down at the earth, at the impossible chasm between them. He had risked everything for her. A woman he didn't know. A woman from a people who were actively destroying his own. "Why?" she asked, looking up at him again. "Why would you do that?" He was silent for a long time, searching for a way to explain a feeling that had no words in either of their languages. He looked at the creek, then at her. He made a gesture with his hand, a small, fierce motion over his heart. Then he pointed at her. It was a gesture of recognition, of seeing a spirit that matched his own. He saw strength in her. He saw courage, and he had acted to protect it. Slowly, Eleanor stood up, leaving the arrow on the ground. She took a few steps toward him, stopping when she was only an arm's length away. "Sit," she said softly, gesturing to the grassy bank. "Please." He hesitated for a fraction of a second before lowering himself to the ground with an easy grace. She sat as well, facing him, the space between them charged with a fragile, burgeoning trust. The conversation that followed was a patchwork of broken English, Lakota words, and universal gestures. It was slow and halting, but it was real. She told him about Jacob, pointing to the sky to signify his spirit was gone, her hands outlining the shape of a great falling tree. He listened, his dark eyes filled with a deep, knowing empathy. Loss was a familiar country to him. He, in turn, told her of his own life. He spoke the name of his sister, showing with his hands that she was small. He drew the shape of the moon and held up 7 fingers. She was 7 winters old. He spoke of the buffalo, his hands sketching their great, shaggy forms in the air, his expression clouding as he made a sweeping gesture to show that they were vanishing. He spoke of the Black Hills asterisk, Pahasapa asterisk, the sacred heart of his world, and the way the gold-hungry miners were scarring it, poisoning its streams. In this halting, piecemeal way, They exchanged the truths of their lives. They were not a white woman and an Indian warrior. They were Eleanor, a woman who had lost her love, and Tasunke, a man who was losing his world. They were two people defined by grief, clinging to a piece of land that was both a sanctuary and a battleground. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows through the canyon, Tasunke reached for a small leather pouch at his belt. From it, he drew a necklace. It was a simple leather thong, but hanging from it were 3 small, irregularly shaped stones of a stunning sky blue color, turquoise. "This," he said, holding it out to her in his open palm, "is for protection. It holds the color of the sky, the spirit of the water. It keeps the heart strong." Eleanor looked at the offering, her eyes filling with tears. It was a gift of profound meaning, a piece of his beliefs, his culture. With trembling fingers, she took it from him. The stones were cool and smooth against her skin. "I can't," she whispered. "It's too much." "For you," he insisted, his gaze compelling. "You have a strong heart. This will help you keep it." She looked at the necklace, then at his earnest face. This was more than a gift. It was a bond, an acceptance. She nodded, unable to speak, and slipped the necklace over her head. The stones came to rest just at the hollow of her throat, a cool, steady weight. A powerful impulse seized her, a need to give him something in return, something of equal meaning. It had to be a piece of her own story, her own past. "Wait," she said, scrambling to her feet. "Don't go." She ran. She ran all the way back to the cabin, her heart pounding. She burst through the door and went to the small chest where she kept Jacob's few possessions. Not his rifle, not his clothes. She reached past his shaving razor and his spare spectacles until her fingers closed around it his whittling knife. It was a small thing, a simple folding knife with a worn wooden handle, smoothed and darkened by the constant touch of his hand. He had carved countless things with it, a small wooden bird for her on their first anniversary, the handle of her favorite spoon, the notches on the cabin logs. It held the memory of his hands, his patience, his quiet love. She ran back to the creek, breathless, clutching the knife in her hand. Tasunke was still there, waiting patiently, a dark, still figure against the bright water. She stopped in front of him, her chest heaving, and held it out to him on her open palm, just as he had done for her. "This was my husband's," she said, her voice soft but clear. "He made things with it. Good things. It holds a good spirit." Tasunke looked at the knife. He saw the worn wood, the patina on the brass fittings. He understood what it was. It was a memory, a piece of the man she had loved. For her to give it to him was an act of trust so complete it stunned him. It was an acknowledgement that her past and her present could coexist, that one did not have to erase the other. He reached out and took the knife, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest of moments. The touch was like a spark, a jolt of lightning that shot up her arm. He opened the blade. It was sharp and well cared for. He nodded slowly, a deep understanding passing between them. He closed the knife and slipped it into the pouch at his belt. He had accepted a piece of her past, and she had accepted his protection for her future. The sun was high now. The magic of the dawn had given way to the hard reality of the day. "You must be careful," he said, his voice a low warning. "Barrett will not forget. The blue coats will listen to his crooked words." "And you?" she asked, her heart aching with the danger she had brought him. "What will you do?" "I will watch," he said. It was both a promise and a statement of fact. It was who he was. He stood up, and she rose with him. The time for words was over. He gave her one last, long look, his eyes holding a universe of unspoken thoughts. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and melted back into the trees, leaving her alone by the creek, the turquoise stones cool against her throat, the world forever changed. The days that followed their first meeting were a study in quiet transformation. Their sanctuary, once a place of solitary ritual, became a shared world, a secret island in the midst of a hostile sea. The dawn remained Eleanor's alone, a silent acknowledgement that some things were too dangerous to change. But the afternoons, in the long, slanting light that turned the canyon to gold, those became theirs. They would meet at the creek, their encounters cloaked in the heavy stillness of the hottest part of the day. Fear was their constant companion, a third presence that sat with them on the grassy bank. Every snap of a twig, every distant bird call, would make them fall silent, their eyes scanning the ridge, their bodies tensed. But the pull toward each other was stronger than the fear. It was a hunger for connection that had starved for too long in the barren loneliness of their lives. Their hands were the first to learn a new language, a brush of fingers as he passed her a wild berry he had picked, the warmth of his hand covering hers as he showed her how to read the tracks of a deer in the soft mud by the water's edge, her touch on his arm, a light, fleeting gesture, as she laughed at her own clumsy attempt to pronounce a Lakota word. Each touch was a small fire, a spark that sent a jolt of warmth through the chill of their isolation. Their first kiss was as inevitable and as natural as the turning of the seasons. They were sitting close, watching the water skaters dance on the surface of a still pool, when he turned to her, his dark eyes searching her face. He had been explaining the meaning of the patterns on his bracelet, the blue for the sky, the white for the purity of the spirit, and his voice had grown soft. The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken words and rising emotion. He raised a hand, his calloused fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw, a touch so tender it made her breath catch in her throat. Slowly, he leaned in. It was a question, not a demand. He gave her every chance to turn away, to retreat back into the safety of their careful friendship. Eleanor did not move. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed, and met his lips with her own. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, aching discovery. It was soft and hesitant, a mapping of unfamiliar territory. It tasted of wild sage and the faint, clean scent of the wind. It was a kiss that spoke of shared sorrow and a desperate, burgeoning hope. When they finally broke apart, they rested their foreheads together, breathing the same air, their shared world shrinking to the small, sacred space between them. From that day on, a new, more dangerous current ran beneath their meetings. The touches became more deliberate. The glances held a fraction longer. The hunger was no longer just for connection, but for a deeper intimacy, a physical expression of the bond that had formed in their souls. A stolen kiss in the deep shade of the cottonwoods, a lingering embrace that lasted just a little too long. The feel of his strong arms around her, a promise of a safety the world could not offer. This blossoming love was a beautiful, terrifying thing, a rare flower blooming on the edge of a cliff. The world beyond their canyon did not remain silent. Clint Barrett, true to his word, had spread his poison. The talk in town, which Eleanor heard on her rare and necessary trips for supplies, was of a savage hiding in the hills near the Hartley claim, of the widow who was too friendly with the redskins. The whispers followed her like a shadow. The glances she received were a mixture of fear, pity, and contempt. Then the soldiers came. Not to her cabin, not at first, but their presence was a constant, looming threat. She would hear the faint, brassy call of a bugle carried on the wind from the direction of the fort. She would see patrols of blue-coated cavalrymen in the distance, their formations a stark, disciplined line against the wild, rolling plains. They rode with a grim purpose, their carbines held at the ready, their faces set. They were hunting. The military presence changed the very air they breathed. It made every meeting a gamble, every moment together a risk of the highest order. Tasunke became more cautious. His senses stretched to an almost unbearable tautness. He would appear at their meeting spot as if from the earth itself, and vanish just as silently, leaving Eleanor's heart pounding with a mixture of relief at his arrival and dread for his departure. The pressure was building in his world as well. He told her of the tension in his camp. The patrols were making the game scarce, and the soldiers made no distinction between a peaceful hunting party and a band of warriors. Several young Lakota men had been detained, questioned, and beaten for simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The elders were counseling patience, but the younger warriors were restless, their anger a hot coal fanned by every new indignity. The consensus was growing they had to move. The plan was to travel south, toward the Powder River country, to join with other bands of Lakota and Cheyenne for the winter, away from the encroaching forts and the iron road of the white man. Tasunke was torn. His duty, his family, his entire way of life was pulling him south. Every instinct for survival screamed that he should go with them, but his heart was anchored to this small canyon, to the woman with the clear, courageous eyes and a spirit as strong as the mountain granite. To leave her felt like a betrayal, like abandoning a part of his own soul. To stay felt like an act of self-destruction, an invitation to a fate he knew would be swift and merciless. He came to her one late afternoon when the sun was a fiery orange ball sinking toward the mountains. The light bathed the canyon in a sad, beautiful glow. She saw the truth in his eyes before he spoke a single word. The easy warmth of their recent meetings was gone, replaced by a deep, immovable sorrow. "My people are leaving," he said, his voice low and rough. "We go with the next moon, south." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. She had known this was a possibility, an inevitability, but she had pushed the thought away, hiding it in the deepest corners of her heart. Now, it was here, real and unavoidable. "Leaving?" she asked, her voice a hollow echo of his. "The bluecoats. They are a disease on the land," he said, his gaze distant. "There will be fighting. It is not safe here." "And you?" she asked, her throat tight. "You are going with them." He looked at her then, and she saw the raw conflict in his eyes, the agony of his choice. "I am Lakota. They are my people. I must protect them." She nodded, a single, jerky motion. She understood duty. She understood loyalty. She had stayed on this land out of a sense of duty to Jacob's memory. How could she ask him to abandon a cold, desolate emptiness opened up inside her, a loneliness she thought she had finally banished? "This is our last time," she stated, the words tasting like ash. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. The silence that fell between them was profound, filled with all the things they could never say, all the futures they could never have. The sun dipped below the ridge, and the canyon was plunged into the soft, purple light of twilight. Eleanor looked at him, at his strong, stoic face, at the pain he tried so hard to hide. In that moment, she knew that a simple goodbye would not be enough. It would leave a wound that would never heal. They had built something beautiful and fragile in this secret place, and it deserved more than to simply fade away into a sad memory. It deserved a final, burning tribute. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Don't go yet," she whispered. She led him away from the bank, deeper into the shelter of the cottonwoods, to a small, hidden clearing carpeted with soft moss and last year's fallen leaves. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. He followed without question, his hand holding hers tightly. There, in the gathering dark, she turned to face him. She raised her hands to his face, her palms cupping his jaw. "Tasunke," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. He brought his own hands up to cover hers, his touch gentle in the fading light. He looked at her, truly saw her, and she saw him, not as a white woman or a Lakota warrior, but as two souls on the brink of an impossible farewell. Desire, sharp and fierce, rose to meet the sorrow. It was a desperate need to claim this one last moment, to burn a memory so bright it could light the long, lonely years ahead. She leaned in and kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation. It was a kiss of raw, desperate passion, a claiming and a surrender all at once. His arms went around her, pulling her tight against the hard strength of his body. She could feel the powerful beat of his heart against her own. Her hands moved from his face, tangling in his long, soft hair, pulling him closer. It was a kiss that broke through all barriers, all fears, all differences. There was no past, no future, only this single, incandescent moment, with a shared, unspoken understanding. He lowered her gently to the mossy ground. The world outside their small clearing ceased to exist. There were no soldiers, no prejudice, no impending separation. There was only the sound of their breathing, the rustle of leaves, the soft murmur of the nearby creek, and the frantic, beautiful beating of their own hearts in the deep twilight of their sacred place. For one night, they laid claim to a love that the world would never allow, a fire that burned all the more fiercely because they both knew it was destined to be consumed by the dawn. The first light of dawn was a cruel and honest thing. It filtered through the canopy of leaves, not with the gentle promise of their earlier meetings, but with the cold, sharp clarity of an ending, lying on the soft moss, wrapped in the fading warmth of the night. Eleanor felt the chill of the morning air on her bare skin and knew their borrowed time was over. Tazunke was already awake, sitting beside her, a silent, powerful silhouette against the growing light. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the creek, his expression carved from stone. The intimacy they had shared, a desperate, beautiful fire in the darkness, now felt like a fragile memory, the reality of their worlds, which they had held at bay for one perfect night, came rushing back with the sun. He was a Lakota warrior whose people were being hunted. She was a white widow on a piece of land that both their peoples coveted. The space between them was no longer filled with whispered words and gentle touches, but with the vast, unbridgeable chasm of their lives. She sat up, pulling the rough wool of her dress around her shoulders. The movement was clumsy, a return to the modesty and convention that felt absurd after the raw honesty of the night. He heard the rustle and turned to look at her, his eyes holding the same deep sorrow she felt in her own heart. There were no words for this. No language could contain the weight of their goodbye. "You should go," she said, her voice a rough whisper, "before it is fully light." "I will not leave you like this," he answered, his voice a low rumble. "We must speak." They dressed in silence. A quiet, heartbreaking return to their separate identities. Her calico dress and worn leather boots, his buckskin leggings and moccasins, when they were once again clothed in the uniforms of their opposing worlds. They walked to the bank of the creek, their creek, and sat on the cold, damp earth. The flat rock where their silent conversation had begun sat between them, empty. "I cannot ask you to stay," Eleanor began, her gaze fixed on the water flowing over the smooth stones. "I know what it would mean. For you, for your people. To stay is to die," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. It was a simple statement of fact. The Bluecoats will not stop looking. Barrett has given them the story they wanted to hear. A warrior hiding in these hills is a threat they will not ignore. They will hunt me, and when they find me, they will not stop until my entire camp is punished for my crime. "Your crime," she repeated bitterly, "was saving my life." "My crime was being seen," he corrected gently. "And my greater crime would be to stay and lead them to my family, to my sister. I cannot do that." Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sharp. "And I cannot go. This land, this cabin, it is all I have left of my husband, and it is all I have made for myself. If I run now, I let men like Clint Barrett win. I prove them right, that a woman cannot survive alone. I cannot." It was the tragic, immovable truth of their situation. He was bound by his duty to his people, and she was anchored by her fierce, stubborn need to hold her ground. Their love, as powerful and real as the mountains that surrounded them, was not strong enough to move these two fundamental pillars of their existence. It could not change the world they lived in. He reached into the pouch at his belt, the one that held the knife she had given him. He bypassed it, his fingers searching deeper, and pulled out a small object wrapped in a piece of soft doe skin. He unwrapped it carefully. Lying in his palm was a small, intricately carved amulet. It was made of bone, polished smooth and yellowed with age, and etched with the figure of a hawk in flight. A single, small hole was drilled through the top, threaded with a leather thong. "This was my father's," Tasunke said, his voice thick with reverence. "It is carved from the shoulder bone of a great buffalo, from a time when my people followed the herds and the whole world was our home. The hawk is a messenger. It sees everything from above. It has a strong spirit, a free spirit." He held it out to her. "It will protect you. It will give you the strength to see the dangers that are coming and the wisdom to endure them. My father gave it to me when I became a man. Now, I give it to you." Eleanor stared at the amulet, her heart aching. This was not a simple trinket. This was a piece of his soul, his heritage, his father's spirit. It was an object of immense spiritual power, a link to the world that was vanishing all around him. For him to give it to her was to entrust her with his legacy. "Tasunke, no," she whispered, shaking her head. "It is too important. It is yours." "What is mine is now a part of you," he said simply, his gaze intense. "Our spirits have touched. This will keep that connection alive when I am gone. Take it, Eleanor, please." With a trembling hand, she reached out and let him place the amulet in her palm. The bone was cool and smooth, but it seemed to vibrate with a latent energy. She curled her fingers around it, holding it tight. It felt like holding on to him. She knew she had to give him something in return, something that held the same weight, the same history. Her eyes fell to her left hand, to the simple, thin band of gold on her third finger, Jacob's ring. She had not taken it off since the day he had placed it there, a symbol of a promise and a life they were supposed to build together. It had defined her. It was the mark of who she was, a wife, then a widow, for months. It had been a comfort, a link to the man she had loved and lost. But now, it also felt like a chain, binding her only to the past. Her love for Tasunke did not diminish what she had felt for Jacob, but it had changed her. She was no longer just a widow mourning a lost love. She was a woman who had found a new one, a fierce and impossible love that had awakened a part of her she didn't know existed. With a deep, shuddering breath, she began to work the ring over her knuckle. It resisted, clinging to the place it had occupied for so long. She had grown thin, but her knuckles were still rough from hard work. Finally, with a painful twist, it came free. It lay in her palm, a perfect, unbroken circle of gold, gleaming in the pale morning light. She held it out to him. Tasunke stared at the ring, his eyes wide with a stunned understanding of what she was doing. He knew what it was. He had seen them on the hands of the white women in the forts. He knew it was their most sacred symbol of belonging to a man. "This was my husband's promise to me," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "It represents my life with him, the love I had for him. It is the most important piece of my past. I want you to have it, so that you know that what we shared was just as real, so you can carry a piece of my heart with you, just as I will carry a piece of yours." This was her ultimate act of trust. She was not erasing her past, but entrusting it to him. She was acknowledging that her heart was large enough to hold two great loves, and that he was worthy of holding the symbol of the first. He reached out, his fingers shaking almost imperceptibly, and took the ring from her. It looked small and delicate in his large, calloused palm. He closed his hand around it, his expression a mixture of awe and profound sorrow. He understood the magnitude of her gift. He had given her a piece of his spiritual armor, and she had given him the key to her entire history. "I will keep it until my spirit leaves this world," he vowed, his voice raw. There was nothing left to say. The sun was climbing higher, its light now sharp and unforgiving. The magic of the night was a distant memory, and the pain of their parting was a raw, physical presence. He stood up, and she rose with him. He reached out, not to kiss her, but to lay his palm gently against her cheek. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, memorizing the feel of his skin against hers for the last time. "Live well, Eleanor Hartley," he whispered. "Live with a strong heart." "Travel safely, Tasunke," she answered, her voice breaking. He dropped his hand, and the loss of his touch was a sudden, searing cold. He gave her one last, long look, his dark eyes burning her image into his memory. Then he turned. He did not look back. He walked to the edge of the trees and, with the silent grace that was his nature, he was gone. Eleanor stood alone on the bank of the creek, the bone amulet clutched in her hand. The silence he left behind was immense, a deafening void where his presence had been. A single, hot tear escaped and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. The pain was a physical weight, a crushing force that threatened to bring her to her knees. But she did not fall. She stood tall, her feet planted firmly on the earth she refused to surrender. The sorrow was a storm inside her, but it was not the same hopeless, empty grief that had crippled her after Jacob's death. This pain was different. It was the beautiful, terrible agony of a heart that had been broken open, not just by loss, but by a love so profound it had changed the very fiber of her being. She looked at the amulet in her hand, its smooth, strong surface, a promise. She had to face Clint Barrett and the scorn of the world alone. She had to face the coming winter, the biting winds, the deep, isolating snows. But she would not be the same woman who had stumbled upon this creek months ago. That woman was gone. In her place stood a woman who had been seen, who had been cherished, who had loved across an impossible divide. Love had not conquered the brutal reality of the West, but it had forged a strength in her that no hardship could ever break. She had his memory, and for now, it would have to be enough. Years bled into one another, each season etching new lines onto the landscape and onto Eleanor's face. The winter after Tasunke left was the hardest of her life. The snows came early and stayed late, burying the world in a deep, suffocating silence. The loneliness was a physical entity, a cold phantom that sat by her fire and lay beside her in bed. But the bone amulet, which she wore constantly under her dress, was a secret warmth against her skin, a tangible reminder of a love that had been real. She would hold it in her hand, the image of his face, the memory of his touch, a shield against the despair. Clint Barrett did not bring the cavalry. His story of a savage ambush was met with skepticism by a military command already stretched thin and wary of starting a war over a saloon owner's disputed land claim. But his campaign of intimidation continued. He made her life a quiet misery, ensuring her supplies were lost on the trail from town, spreading rumors that made even the kindest townsfolk shy away from her. He was waiting for her to break. She did not break. The memory of Tasunke's courage had become her own. She learned to be more self-sufficient than ever, to hunt small game with the rifle Jacob had left her, to forage for edible roots and berries as she imagined Tasunke's people did. Her hands grew rougher, her body leaner, her spirit harder. The turning point came 2 years after Tasunke's departure, in the form of a broken wagon and another woman's grief. Sarah Blackwood was a widow from back east, her husband having died of cholera on the trail just a week before reaching the town. The land he had bought, sight unseen, was adjacent to Eleanor's. The town, led by Barrett, saw her as another easy mark. They offered her pennies on the dollar for her deed. expecting her to flee back to the safety of her former life. But Sarah, a quiet, stoic woman with tired eyes and a spine of steel, saw in Eleanor a reflection of her own unwanted and underestimated strength. They found in each other a companionship that had nothing to do with men or marriage. It was a partnership born of shared hardship and a mutual refusal to be erased. They pooled their resources and their labor. Sarah had a little money from the sale of her home back east. Eleanor had an intimate knowledge of the land and the skills to survive on it. Together, they hired a lawyer from a larger town to solidify their claims, their two names on the legal documents a bulwark against Barrett's challenges. Their homesteads became a small, thriving community of two. They built a larger barn together, raised chickens and a few hardy cattle, and planted a large, shared garden. Their success was a quiet but powerful act of defiance. They became a local legend of sorts, the widows of Hartley Creek. Two women who had looked the harshness of the West in the eye and had not flinched. Eleanor never remarried. Suitors came and went, drawn by the success of the homestead. But her heart remained a closed and private country. Her secret was kept safe in the canyon, in the cool, clear water of the creek. 20 years passed. The world changed. The railroad had sliced its way across the plains, bringing more settlers, more towns, more fences. The last of the great buffalo herds were gone. The Lakota had been forced onto reservations, their old way of life a fading memory. The fierce, empty wilderness Eleanor had first encountered was being tamed, section by section. Eleanor was now a woman of 48. Her hair was streaked with silver, and her face was a map of sun and sorrow and laughter. She was respected, even admired, by the very people who had once scorned her. One bright, cool autumn afternoon, she was on her porch, mending a leather harness, when she saw a rider approaching. It was not a common sight. Most visitors used the newer, more direct road to Sarah's cabin. This rider came on the old trail, the one that wound past the entrance to her canyon. He was a young Lakota man, perhaps 20 years of age, riding a lean pinto pony. He was dressed in a mixture of his people's traditional clothing and the durable trousers and shirt of the white man. As he drew closer, Eleanor's heart gave a painful, powerful lurch. It was his face. He had his mother's high cheekbones, but his jaw, his brow, and the intense, steady gravity in his dark eyes, they were all Tasunki's. He stopped his horse a respectful distance from the porch and dismounted. He stood for a long moment, simply looking at her, his gaze taking in the cabin, the neat stacks of wood, and the woman with the silver-streaked hair. "Are you the one they call Eleanor Hartley?" he asked. His English was clear and unaccented, the language of the mission schools. "I am," she said, her voice hoarse. She slowly set the harness aside, her hands trembling. "My father sent me," the young man said. "He told me I would find a woman with a strong heart living by a secret creek. He said the cabin would smell of pine and sourdough." Eleanor's hand instinctively went to her throat, her fingers closing over the smooth, familiar shape of the bone amulet she still wore. "Your father—" "My father was Tasunki," the young man said. "My name is Chaitin." The name Tasunki, spoken aloud after 20 years of silence, was a key that unlocked a flood of memory and emotion so powerful it threatened to overwhelm her. She gripped the porch railing to steady herself. "Tasunki," she breathed. Is he well?" "He is with the spirits now," Chaitin said, his voice soft but clear of any tremor. "He walked the Star Road 2 seasons ago, but his spirit is strong. Before he left, he told me many stories. He told me of a winter when the world was changing, and of a brave Wasichu woman who was not afraid of the dawn." He reached into a leather pouch at his side. "He told me that if I ever came to this land, I was to find you. He gave me something to return to you, a promise. He called it a piece of your heart that he had guarded for all his life." Chaitin opened his hand, lying in his palm, its gold catching the afternoon sun. was a simple, thin wedding band. Eleanor stared at the ring, and the 20 years that had separated her from her love collapsed into a single, heartbreaking moment. It was here. It had come home. She saw it all, Tasunki's face in the twilight, his hand closing around this very ring, his vow to keep it until his spirit left the world, and he had... Tears streamed freely down her face, but they were not tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of gratitude, of wonder, of a love so powerful it had crossed the boundaries of death and time. She slowly descended the porch steps and walked toward the young man, this impossible, miraculous echo of the man she had loved. She held out her own trembling hand, and Chayton gently placed the ring in her palm. It felt just the same, a perfect, unbroken circle. "He never forgot you," Chayton said softly. "Your story was a part of our family. My mother knew of you. She understood. She said that a man's heart can have many rooms, and that love does not make one smaller to make space for another. It only makes the heart grow larger." Eleanor looked at this strong, brave young man, the living legacy of their impossible love, and she saw the truth of it. Her love for Jacob had been real and true, and her love for Tasunke had been just as real, just as true. They did not cancel each other out. They had both made her who she was. The sun began to set, bleeding its familiar crimson and gold across the western sky. The evening was quiet, the air crisp with the coming cold. Eleanor was an old woman now, her steps slower, her bones carrying the ache of many winters. But every morning, without fail, she still made the walk to the creek. She no longer bathed in the icy water, but she would sit on the bank, on the same spot where she had first waited for him, and watch the sun rise. She would hold the bone amulet in one hand and the gold ring in the other, the two halves of her heart, finally reunited. And sometimes, in the deep silence of the dawn, when the light first touched the highest peaks of the canyon, she could still feel it, a gentle, steady presence on the far ridge, a watchfulness that was as patient and as silent as the ancient rocks themselves. It was not a ghost. It was the memory of a love so true it had become a permanent part of the landscape. A silent story whispered by the water and the wind. She was seen. She would always be seen. Thank you for listening to this story. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from to connect with fellow listeners and share your thoughts. Please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Tales, and give this video a like. And if this story moved you, please support us further by hitting the hype button to help it reach more people.